Thanks, Jen, for that generous introduction. I've known of Jen for a long time, her work in Afghanistan, and so it's a pleasure to finally meet her and to meet all of you and to be here. I'm going to just plunge into the talk, and I hope there'll be time questions and answers because I think that's the way you can get more insights. I'm going to be talking about what I'm calling reflexivism. I have a former student who is very upset. He says, "Vijay, you need to pick a bigger, better term." But anyway, that's what I'm living with now. So let me plunge into it by trying to explain what it is, and I'll give you examples. If you look at the dominant paradigms of policymaking around the world, there are, in my view, three, and I'm not trying to claim that these are mutually exclusive. There's a lot of overlap between them, but they're ideal types. They're things that you can help to sort out your mind with. The first one is liberal, old-fashioned liberal, John Stuart Mill liberal, which is free markets, free elections, democracy, free thought, free speech, and the Milton Friedmanian version of that, which has been deeply influential in the United States. Free markets, laissez-faire, reduce the government's influence in the world, and so that has been enormously influential around the world. The emphasis on growth and innovation. Then you have what is sort of the bulk of policy making, which, for lack of a better term, I'm going to call Keynesian, which is what most governments do all over the world: taxation, expenditure, investment, fiscal policy, monetary policy, all combined into one package. Use the various different levers of government to make things happen, to implement policy of different kinds, education policy, health policy, all of these kinds of things, where there's a fair amount of government intervention informed by social science research. The point of the liberal way of thinking is that it believes that social scientists should get out of the way. Just let people be, right? Keynesianism, because of John Maynard Keynes after the Great Depression, says, no, we social scientists, economists, and others know what we're doing. So therefore, policy should be informed by academic thinking, and there should be that conversation between them. And that's what you learn in most public policy schools, including this one, I'm sure. So that's the big category. And the third one, which is about, I would say, had its sort of dominant time, been around for about 20 years as a very important paradigm, becoming more important by the day, what I'm calling neo-paternalist. And that's where there's even stronger emphasis on the smartness of social scientists. That we have figured everything out. We are scientists. We're going to RCT5, do randomized trials just like the doctors do, and tell you exactly what the answer is to a particular problem. And that cumulative knowledge is going to change the world because we will finally have evidence-based policymaking. Okay? And then, of course, the psychologists and the experimental economists have come together and started developing nudges, that I'm going to nudge you in a way without you even knowing what is good for you, so that you'll do things that are better for yourself. Nudging is, by the way, a huge thing around the world. And it's this whole behavioral sort of insights group at the World Bank, the behavioral insights groups all over the world, nudging people to death. So they go in increasing emphasis on the belief that the social sciences have figured stuff out, right? I come from a slightly different perspective. In that way, I have more in common with the liberal point of view, though, of course, I don't believe that free markets give all the answers to the world, which is the following. Like Max Weber, I believe social scientists need to be deeply humble, right? We're trying, we all try. But to say that we know things well enough that we can give you clear answers without caveats here and there, without a lot of deep sort of reluctance to sort of say that this is what I know, this is what I don't know, and I don't think you should experiment and figure it out, that's where I am, So I don't believe social scientists have figured it out. In fact, I worry most about nudges, right? Now, what is the reflexive paradigm? It's a paradigm as a paradigm. It's been around for a very, very long time. And most famously, perhaps, in the work of Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize, 15 years ago. But the basic point is this. It's basically what's known as the principle of subsidiarity. Give local folks as much control as is feasible. Give the level of government the kind of authority that level of government can do the most with, where it has the most knowledge, most capacity, most ability. You don't want to tell the government, the municipal government of Pittsburgh to run US foreign policy, though they might do a better job. But obviously not, or defense. But how to fix Pittsburgh schools? That should be local. Yeah. So what you then do is that you start prioritizing, even below government, the voice of citizens in things that are done to them. Why should things be done to us as people? Shouldn't we be involved in things that are done to us? So prioritize citizen control over decisions that affect their lives. And that means that when we start thinking about democracy, we can't just think about elections. Those are terribly important. We also have to think about deliberative democracy, where we make decisions by consensus. What is democracy after all? It's a technology to facilitate collective action. That's pretty much all it is. And in the 18th century, with the French and American revolutions, it became a thing that then took over the world, which was elections. We have a representative going and making decisions for us that we kick out after 4 or 5 years or 6 years. We don't like them. If there's electoral accountability. That's what we think of as democracy. It's a very important thing. But this is all form of democracy that all our ancestors practiced, where we figured out things by coming in groups, discussing, debating, and coming to a point of consensus, agreeing to disagree. That's deliberation. That's what I've called, because of a particular reason I'll get to in a second, oral democracy. Yeah. Co-production, that's Austrian. It's her word. The idea that when we do policy, it has to be in conversation with the people we're doing policy to. It has to be something that comes in sync with them, that has their input, works in a feedback process. So they may not have expertise, and I don't know, in figuring out where the water is under the ground. So you get a water engineer to help them with that. Maybe they don't know how to build a dam. You get a civil engineer to help them with that. But otherwise, where to place the dam, where to set up the school location, these regular folks know more. Why should regular folks be excluded because somebody educated at Harvard University or Princeton University or the University of Pittsburgh has decided that they have figured it out because they know the literature? That's the part that we need to change, I think, because we need to bring people in. All right. So therefore, democracy at the end, this is all about, at the end, is democracy, broadly defined, has to be not just about the election itself, but about the period in between elections. What are the decisions? How do we bring people in throughout that process? Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift now to India because that's where I do most of my work. That doesn't mean that this is not relevant for other parts of the world. I believe it is. But I'll talk about the work I've been doing for the last 20 years, 2 or 3 things from there in India. And they're going to talk about two things, mainly the 73rd Amendment to the Indian Constitution, the self-help group movement. Right. So I'm going to be talking about 3 modalities, and there are, as I said, many, many, many more. Deliberation, which I've already talked about. Democratizing data. Why can't regular folks be involved with collecting and analyzing data? Why do you need a PhD in economics to do that? Particularly now that you have AI to sort of just ask questions to give you answers. Data should become a democratic process, and I call data a process. It's not a thing. It's a way by which we study ourselves. That's what it should be. Okay, and I'm going to make a case for democracy itself, for electoral. I don't want to exclude electoral democracy from all of this. I'm going to give you evidence that electoral democracy is better than the alternative. Okay. Okay, so let's start with deliberative democracy. And this is, again, John Elster, the political scientist, said this very nicely. He called electoral democracy the aggregation of preferences, the aggregation of interests. What does that mean? We're all of us, in a small room like this, but imagine that we were multiplied by 100,000. There's no way of knowing what everybody wants. Yeah. But if we had an election where there were 2 candidates, let's keep it simple, one with a certain point of view and another point of view, we can vote for the candidate whose ideas, whose beliefs, whose ways of working suit us the most. We give them a vote, or the others give the other person a vote. You add the votes, and the first past the post system, the person who gets the most votes wins. That's aggregation, that's adding. Yeah? So the adding of preferences is electoral democracy. Consensual transformation of preferences is deliberative democracy. Because there, I'm going to sit in this smaller room. I can't do it with 100,000 people, not yet. Maybe there'll be a time in the future, but not very far away, when we can with technology. But right now in this room, I can say that, hey, we need to really decide how many times this carpet needs to be cleaned every day. And somebody else has said, we have classes here, they can't do it every day. It's got to be done 2 times a day. No, look at it. There's a coffee stain there. It better be taken out. Sorry, there is actually a coffee stain there. So can that happen? Yeah. And you can have this debate about whether that makes sense or not, and try to persuade, like you do in your families, like you do in your apartment complexes and other things, right? Now, I'm going to be talking about the Indian Gram Sabha. Gram Sabha literally translates into village meeting, which is the largest deliberative body in human history because it covers 2 million villages in India and over 800 million people. It started with the 73rd Amendment to the Indian Constitution in 1992, which gave a lot of power to village governments. Not to urban governments, interesting, but village governments. There were independent elections to village councils. At least 2 village meetings had to be held every year, and there were political reservations for disadvantaged groups and women to make sure it was more inclusive, right? And so every Indian village has access to both electoral democracy and deliberative democracy. It's the hybrid nature of it that I think is particularly interesting and effective. So we did a book 4 or 5 years ago on this, and I'm going to be talking about that book, so summarizing what we found. And we look at in those days, there were 4 South Indian states, so now there are 5, but that's not relevant. And it was very interesting because the 4 states had very different. So what happens to Indian constitutional amendments, like American constitutional amendments to some extent, is that there's a federal amendment, but then the state governments take that amendment and turn it into local law that matters only at the state level, at the province level. So what happens is that the amendment was taken and different states did different things with it. The state of Kerala did the most with it. It did extraordinary things, and it's a world-class system of local government now. The state of Karnataka, where I'm from, was sort of medium quality. Neighboring state of Tamil Nadu was medium quality, and the worst of the lot was a state called Andhra Pradesh, which tried to undermine the whole system. They didn't believe in this at all. Okay? So you get a lot of variation. Now, what we did was between 2003 2004, a long time ago now, we recorded about 300 Gram Sabhas in the 4 South Indian states. And we transcribed and translated them from the 4 South Indian languages. Each one is a very distinct language, like English and French, and very, very different languages. But we did it in the context of a national experiment, which I'll show you in a second. And we also studied the load of literacy, because there's a lot of stuff. If you read the grand guru of deliberative democracy, a fellow called Habermas, you might have read, it seems like everything is in an Austrian coffee shop. And you need that sort of culture. Without it, you can't do deliberation. So I find Habermas galling sometimes. Yeah? Even though he's still alive, he's almost 100. Amazing man and brilliant man, so don't get me wrong. But there is this idea that deliberation can only happen in weird societies, Western, whatever, educated, whatever it is. Yeah, it's just simply not true, because that's the reason we wrote the book, to show you that that's not the case. Because the argument is, how can people who can't even read and write deliberate in a common space? I'll show you that that's not right. So what is the national experiment? What happened is, prior to Indian independence in 1947, for a 300-year period, South India, this is a map of South India, was divided into political entities that had a 300-year history, had what's called the princely state, the kingdom of Mysore, all ruled by the British in one way, either directly or indirectly, but they had a king. Yeah. You had the Madras presidency, which was directly ruled by the British and actually took all that area there. Yeah. You had the princely state of Hyderabad, which is ruled by the Nizam of Hyderabad as an offshoot of the Mughal Empire, right? And there you had basically 2 kingdoms in what is now the state of Kerala, in Travancore and Cochin, that took that state, and a part of Kerala that was ruled directly by the British, by British rule. Yeah. So these broader political entities with the thick borders had a 300-400 year history, common history. What happened in 1956 was that the government of India decided to separate out, to create states that were linguistically contiguous. That is, that the state should speak the same language, because this was a mess. I mean, you have people speaking all kinds of languages, all kinds of people mixed up together, very, very diverse entities. And they said, no, that makes no sense in a big country that's already too diverse. So we're going to make sure that the Indian state of Tamil Nadu, which is going to be created out of the Madras presidency, they're all going to be speaking Tamil, the language of Tamil. The state of Andhra Pradesh, also mainly carved out of direct British rule, is going to be speaking the language Telugu. Kerala, which is going to be honed together from direct British rule and these princely states, is going to speak the language Malayalam. And my home state of Karnataka is going to be mixed up between British rule and old Mysore state. They're going to speak the language Kannada, right? What happens when you do that is that you screw up. When you think of Quebec and Canada and Ontario, you have French speakers in Ontario and English speakers in Quebec. You can't draw a border and expect to have people speak the same language. So we exploit those mistakes to match villages across the modern borders that prior to 1956 belonged to the old political entities. So they had the 300 and 400 years of common history, administrative history, and all kinds of history, and they spoke the same language. And why is language important? Because every linguistic theory, if you study linguistics, you know about this thing called linguistic communities. People talk in a certain way because they're brought up in a particular language, right? So by then separating this out, and we're looking at deliberative spaces, we can ask to what extent is deliberation the creation of culture and language and administrative history, and to what extent is it because of state policy? Get the idea, right? So we then look at these transcripts, and what do we see? Folks are talking about drinking water, roads, education, electricity. You can see that that makes sense. I'm not going to read the transcripts, but I probably maybe I come back because I think we're running out of time. But we find many categories of discourse: competition over public goods, competition over private goods, the politics of recognition, the demand for governance, the supply of governance, that is, the state speaking to citizens, and schools and democracy, which is what John Stuart Mill talked about. These spaces become places where people start pushing the boundaries of democracy. You're a damn corrupt president of my village. I saw you steal the money. I mean, this is all.
Take your time, plenty of time.
Okay, so let me read a transcript then. I'm going to read one transcript that'll help, right? So this is a transcript from the state of Karnataka in the northern part, where there is a village secretary who's a local bureaucrat talking to a bunch of folks in the village. And they're talking about what is called a check dam. And a check dam happens in Indian villages, which is a small little dam. It's about the height of this table and about the length of 2 tables, yeah, to stop flooding and to collect water during the monsoons, yeah, so they can use the water throughout the year. So the secretary says, the bureaucrat, one check dam is completed, but there is provision for one more. A villager says, we don't need another check dam. Why is he saying that? Remember that? Because check dams are a source of the corruption. Basically, it's just a boondoggle. People are stealing money by building these things. The villager said, we don't need another check dam. Then there's an engineer from the government who says, you can't reject the check dam because he's going to make money out of that. Yeah. And the bureaucrat says, there is pressure on us to execute the check dam because he's going to make money out of it. So another villager says, the work of this comes under some other project, not under your authority. You build the check dam in another village. We don't need it in this village. And another engineer working for the government says, one will be built in the other village, but we have to build another one here. And the secretary says, you select the place, we'll build the dam. Another villager says, you execute the work in whichever place is selected, but it will be useless. It's not needed here. The engineer says, don't talk like that. There will be much use from the check dam. It's a way of conserving water during monsoons. We've constructed so many. And then the engineer says, we should execute it now. The villager says, we should not put it on the side of the village. That will be horrible. It'll be flooding with that. You should widen the road with the money, not build the check dam. That's what we need. And the politician says, talk more. And he says, both road and water are required, not a check dam. Okay, then the bureaucrat says, okay, maybe we could do this. And then the president says, yes, the president of the village, the elected body. He says, no, I agree, let's do a road. And then people are screaming and shouting and says, no, yes, we need the road. And then the fellows are going to lose money. The engineer saying, no, we have to have the check dam because there's a good reason for it. This kind of thing. This was the kind of just one meeting. It's an active space in an area that has 60% literacy. Right? And this book is full of those transcripts. Yeah. Online, open access, if you're interested. So these are active spaces. And what we find is that these, in the state of Andhra Pradesh, which doesn't give any emphasis to these spaces at all, there's no conversation that happens. It's just basically a dead space, somebody making a speech, the meeting gets over. You look across the border at a village that is 5 miles away in another state, but speaking the same language, there's a much more civic deliberation that takes place. Yeah. Similarly, in this border, this is AP and Karnataka. In AP, Andhra Pradesh, absolutely compliant, passive petitioners, nothing goes on. In this state, elites towards root citizens like the one I showed you. In the state of Coimbatore and in Tamil Nadu and Palakkad, again, looking at those border villages, very, very different styles of discourse, styles of deliberation, very different styles of speech, showing you at the end that deliberative democracy is not because some people are more culturally attuned to it. It's entirely a matter of legislation and state policy. Anybody can be given, if they're given the space to deliberate, they will deliberate and make decisions. This is entirely possible. Okay? And literacy, we find, does not matter at all, not surprisingly, in Andhra Pradesh, which gave no attention to these spaces because it made no difference whether you're literate or not, everything was useless. It also didn't matter much in places which were very, very good, like Kerala, because everybody was doing pretty well. But there was a wide gap in places which had the space, but didn't have the capacity. Then their literacy mattered. So literacy mattered in the one area where there's, in fact, low literacy and high capacity. Otherwise, it didn't matter, right? Basically, the summary of all of this is literacy is not such a big deal in these spaces. People know because they're led by others, others help them speak. People know how to speak about their interests. They don't need to know how to read and write to do that. So you can now, by the way, India is far more literate than it was in those days. Deliberation makes a lot of sense, right? So that's that book. We did another little piece with the same data where people say, hey, it'll all be captured by elites. So we studied that by doing a survey of 10,000 households in the same villages where we collected the transcripts. And we asked each person who we surveyed, was a randomly selected person in the village, what are your top 3 priorities of what the village government should do for you? And they listed the top 3 priorities. And then they had all their demographic characteristics, of course. We matched those priorities listed by the citizens by what was actually spoken in the village meetings. And when there was a match, we then do a regression trying to see whose interests get represented in that village meeting. And we find, ironically and interestingly, it was the median citizen, the person right in the middle, just as good democratic theory says it should be. It's the median interest that dominates. You measure a median by listing everybody from top to bottom, the highest and the lowest, and pick the one in the middle.
The highest and the lowest in terms of what?
Anything you want. A median is just it's like an average. Yeah. Okay. So there are 3 ways of measures of central statistics 101. 3 measures of central tendency: mean, median, and mode. Yeah. So this is the median. Oh, okay. Is that your question? Oh, sorry.
I know what a median is. I want to know what's the variable here.
So the variable for the median. Sorry, I misunderstood. The variable for the median was land. Okay, so the variable for the median was land and education. My apologies. I didn't mean to be condescending, but I just thought that there was a lack of knowledge on this topic. Okay, sorry. Okay, so that was what it was. Yeah? I forget I'm at a university sometimes. All right, now moving on about democratizing data. And we're looking at something that we're calling participatory tracking in Tamil Nadu. Now, what is the context here? The context here is a network of women's self-help groups. This is a system by which all women in the village, in this case all, it's not always the case that it's all, are gathered into groups of 12 to 13 women. There are about 20 to 30 such groups in every village. They all are there ostensibly for credit, to sort of have group credit, but it's actually for a lot of other things, right? And what it really does is create a mini social movement in that village, women's movement. Because you have all these groups of women now who don't generally hang out with each other, all hanging out with each other regularly every week, meeting and plotting. Okay, and the next book that will be coming out in 6 months is going to be about that. Yeah. So what we got these women's networks to do was to come to a workshop as representatives and develop a questionnaire that measured their idea of what well-being was. Not my idea or some professor's idea, their idea. We just helped them take that questionnaire and turn it to something that's only 30 minutes long. This, by the way, we did 11 years ago, 30 minutes long, okay? And what makes this questionnaire different is that if you take the standard household survey used in India, there's only a 17% overlap. There's more of an overlap from some other surveys, but the Indian survey has only a 17% overlap with the themes covered here. Range of themes and so on covered. Let me give you some sample of questions. A standard question in an Indian questionnaire will say, how much do you spend on the purchase of vegetables in a month? Here, the question, think about this question. Does the person who eats last get enough to eat? Who is the person who eats last in an Indian household? It's the mother. Is the mother going hungry? And when mother's going hungry, that means it's a hungry household, right? What was the age at the time of marriage is a standard question. The question they ask, was the decision taking into account at the time of your marriage? Did you marry your relative? Both relevant questions in that context, because it's only arranged marriage. Very few people are marrying out of love. There's a lot of inter-relative marriage, uncle, niece, first cousins, and that kind of thing. Did you marry your relative? Who makes decisions on assets and loans in your family? Standard question. Do you decide on what clothes to wear based on your own preferences? Have there been any domestic violence? And of course, in those days, they can use a mobile phone, and they wanted to know, can you read and send text messages? Now they're all using smartphones, a very different context. Very different question. We then took that questionnaire and put it into a tablet. Remember, we were talking something 11 years ago, a Samsung tablet, which was easy to work with by anybody. Data collect from the tablet in those days, now it's routine, was sent directly to the cloud, so nobody could interfere with the data collection. And then we developed data visualizations with a wonderful woman called Cassandra Shea from the MIT Media Lab and us. We all developed it together. And the communities, all again, co-production, co-produced with the communities. These were data visualizations, so the communities could do their own data analysis. So you first saw, this is all in Tamil, you see a village map. You see a map of stuff. And you have different types of representations here. This is a banana tree, some of you might recognize it. The banana tree has banana leaves. In South India, particularly on festive occasions, you eat food on a banana leaf. So that's the food mapping. Here, a flower bed. That flower bed, I'll show you, is about family and life and fertility. Assets, there's a goat, there's a fridge, there's a scooter, there's a house. Digital ability, cash, mobility, traveling around, and intra-household bargaining. When you see this village map, you see these green and gray dots. If you have a green dot, that means your village is doing well on that indicator. If you have a gray dot, it's not doing well in that indicator. Okay? That's the first thing you see. We did this in one district of the state of Tamil Nadu, the state of Theni. There were 32,000 households involved. We did it twice, which means that was the census of that village done by communities themselves. These were the visualizations on decision-making within the household. Is your opinion accepted related to your child's education and marriage? We always compare two villages when we show them these data. And the way it was visualized was, if the woman's decision was taken more into account, her face was bigger. If the man's decisions taking more into account, his face was bigger. If it's the in-laws, the man's husband, father and mother, their faces were bigger. Yeah, and you can immediately see which villages are doing more gender equal. You can see it yourself, right? You don't have to be highly educated to figure this out, and you can then decide what you want to do about it. Assets, two villages side by side. If you lost an asset over the last year, you got a red box around your asset picture. If you gained an asset, you got a green box around your picture. If the asset didn't change, it just stayed the way it was. If the asset was not there at all, it was left blank. Again, tell me which village is doing better. Okay? Flowers in marriage, visual representation. The size of the flower is age at marriage. The color of the flower is whether you married a relative or not. So if it is a red flower, you married a relative. If it's a yellow flower, you didn't. If the flower is a bud, your decision was not taken into account when you married your husband. If it's a flowering flower, your decision was taken into account. Leaves are the number of kids you have. Again, you can say which village, you can decide whether it's better or worse. I don't want to put my views on that, but you can see how these villages are different. Aged marriage, yeah. Diet and nutrition, banana leaf with different foods on it, an eggplant, a papaya, a chicken leg, and rice, representing the obvious things. If it's a blank banana leaf, that means the woman said, I go hungry when I sleep at night. Again, you can see which village is better nourished, right? So all of this was presented in a village meeting, in the Gram Sabha, to make decisions about village budgets. That's how they were done. And the appropriate households targeted if they were going hungry. Okay? So that's a feedback loop there. Just a simple little example done 11 years ago, before AI, before any of this nonsense. It can do stuff that's so much more powerful today. Yeah? And I don't know why it can't be done in the United States. By the way, the First Peoples in Canada do this. My friend Chris Anderson leads that project at the University of Alberta. Yeah? So, why aren't we all doing this, is my question. Why do we need a census bureau to collect census data? We did a census within 2 months of 32,000 people. Because we think they're not smart enough. And we have degrees in data science. You don't need degrees in data science to figure out this data. You need a smart visualizer. All right. Finally, I want to talk about the third thing, which is, this is the most recent paper that we did, which we're calling the added value of local democracy, because it's asking about, do elections matter? There's a lot of stuff going on in the world today trying to undermine electoral democracy. I'm trying to point out that electoral democracy matters as well. Okay? So we did a natural experiment. Of course, does democracy matter is a question that's been debated a very, very long time. And it has intrinsic value, instrumental value, all these kinds of things. I'm sure many of you are political scientists, you know this stuff backwards. But it's very hard to answer. Most of the work that tries to answer this question is just cross-country regressions. More democracy, less democracy. I'm indicating on the left-hand side what you believe out of all that stuff, right? So what did we do? What did we do in this paper? We did a natural experiment in the state of Karnataka, again, where I'm from, where what happened during COVID was that local elections were postponed. You know what's interesting? There were 160 villages out of 6,000, which were in a different election cycle. And I'll show you that in a second. But idiosyncratic reasons. So they continued having elected representatives, and according to the law of the government of Karnataka, if elections are postponed, bureaucrats take over the government of that village. It's run by bureaucrats, not by elected officials. So for 2 years, we have this nice comparison between villages run by elected officials and villages run by bureaucrats. And we can test to see whether that makes a difference. Now, it could go either way. Of course, the good stuff is local leaders know and understand local needs. There's electoral accountability. Bad stuff, maybe be captured by elites. Maybe they don't have the skill sets to do government well. Bureaucrats have that skill set. And local leaders may not look at the bigger picture. Of course, the famous Winston Churchill quote that my co-authors didn't want because they don't like Winston Churchill, but I like Winston Churchill, so I like the quote. Anyway, so here we go. This is the timeline. The constitutional amendment happens in 1992. 1993 starts getting implemented. 2000 is an election. In 2010, there is a circular that says 152 villages are on an off cycle. 2020, COVID-19 causes a nationwide shutdown. Then elections are halted, and here is the region time we look at. Yeah. So in terms of the time. Here's how those elected villages were distributed across the whole state. You can see it's not concentrated anywhere, it's everywhere. Yeah. Those elected villages with elected officials are all over the place. And what do they talk? What are they spending their money on? These are sort of areas with water issues, so most of it is spent on water. Then housing, streetlights, toilets, roads, drains, libraries, education, wells, and health, and childcare centers. Those are the major items of expenditure. We're then going to look at citizen priorities in the red line and expenditures in the blue line, and you can see that priorities more or less map with expenditures. But In elected villages, that correlation is much tighter. In elected villages, that correlation is much tighter, and that's the big result of the paper. In fact, if in elected villages, if 10% of more citizens care about an issue, that village spends 0.7% more on that issue. Okay? But having said all of that, here's the clear thing that it's all elected folks are always doing better. But you know who's doing even better amongst those elected folks? It's the men, the upper caste, and the rich. It's not like those guys are doing better. I mean, the poorer folks are doing better in appointed villages. No argument there. The elections are better. But in that elected context, elites do dominate, right? We're finding that too. And there is more deliberation in elected spaces because they're much more likely to hold these gram sabhas. In appointed villages run by bureaucrats, they don't hold the gram sabhas. And this is really, I think, perhaps one of those interesting things that we find. Okay, in the bit of context here, there is the biggest social welfare scheme in India is the NREGA, the National Rural Employment Guarantees Act scheme, whatever. Yeah, basically guarantees 100 days of employment at a good wage to anybody in rural India who needs a job. 100 days of guaranteed employment. You dig wells, you dig ditches, you do basic stuff, right? When the lockdown happened after COVID, lots of people in urban areas lost their jobs, particularly migrants. What did they do? They went back to their villages because there was no welfare system in urban areas. There's a welfare system in rural areas. Why? I don't understand, but that's the fact. They're all running back to their villages because they know there's NREGA, that'll give them some money. So you see this so-called demand. These are the elected villages. The blue line, the red line is the bureaucrat villages. They have a very tight sort of correlation across time in terms of the amount of jobs that they've been handing out. COVID hits, huge increase in demand. But see here, the blue line is better. Yeah, and if you're an economist and say, okay, this is not rigorous, read the paper. Yeah, the blue line is better. So in other words, the NREGA program worked better, they issued job cards, they gave it more employment than the bureaucrats. Not that the bureaucrats didn't do anything, but the elected folks did better. Okay? And bureaucrats are more likely to come to work when their boss is a politician. 10% more. So what are the takeaways from this? Electoral democracy improves governance in various ways. Citizen preferences are better matched for expenditures. Social welfare schemes work better. Bureaucrats come more. And of course, deliberation is more likely to happen. Elections and deliberation work together. So, summary of these results. All of this is reflexive. It's trying to get citizens directly into the process. And it has the potential to vastly improve the relationship between democracy and development. I've said democracy and policy generally. Yeah. It prioritizes people. It creates a sandwich between high levels of government and the people. It emphasizes oral and elected democracy. And it's a hybrid. It combines deliberations and elections. It increases resources and powers to local democratic councils. You know, and this idea of democratizing data to me is such a no-brainer in the age of AI. Why should we be relying on statistical bodies to capture data for us? It doesn't make sense anymore. Every academic I know who's a big data person is looking at administrative data now. It's all public data. Why can't we have citizen data? Yeah. So this is where I'm going to go off now, a little bit off track. Democracy is currently practiced as an 18th century technology. It's out of date, which is why nobody likes it. And it does not work well in this modern age. We can debate that, but I've thought a lot about it, and I feel very strongly about it. And look at the Economist Democracy Index. You see this, and this is 2019, it keeps going down after that, not surprisingly. Support for democracy. Various reasons. Satisfaction, democracy is down. People don't think elected officials care about them. The state is not run for the benefit of all people. Voting is dominated by elites. I call this, the reasons for this 3 C's, and these are well known. I'm not the only one to talk about this. Clientelism, corruption, and capture happens in every elected democracy in the world, including the United States. So that's why people don't like democracy. Why they like autographs. And this is not just me talking. There's overwhelming evidence for this. You can read Jacob Hackett's work and Paul Pearson's work in the United States. You can read my work, many people's work in India. There's a lot of work in Brazil, Claudia Ferraz, a lot of people. Indonesia, Sam Bazi, others. A lot of work around the world on this stuff. So this needs a serious rethink. It needs a reflexive approach. It needs this hybrid approach. Bring citizens directly in. Stop treating them like anonymous entities that only show up every 5 years, 4 years, 6 years to vote. And then everybody is all about who captures the vote, how we message the vote, this candidate, that candidate, all these dramatic things like speaking in Congress for 26 hours, which is, by the way, amazing. But that's not about people. That's about communication. Yeah. There are challenges. How do you connect the local, the provincial, and the federal? How is data used? What is the meaning of data? Where and how much do you delegate decision-making? Monitoring and evaluation at the lowest level, is that possible? How do you do it? Bottom line, we, educated noobs, need to get out of the way. And we need to give power to people. And our job as policy researchers, policy practitioners, is to figure out how to get people in the decision-making process as much as is technically feasible. And I mean that. Sometimes it's not technically feasible. Sometimes it doesn't make sense. We cannot expect somebody in rural India to be a medical doctor or a public health official. But we can certainly expect them to manage a school. Okay? We are the problem. I strongly feel this, and I get shouted at a lot. We are causing more harm than we know. We are causing more harm than we know, because we academics, and I include myself in that process, are so obsessed with publishing in the top journals that we forget about what we're doing this for. And every damn university, every damn research department, including mine, needs to wake up to that reality, because we are wasting resources, money, in pretending that it is in the service of others, but it's really in the service of ourselves. Development is a business. It needs to stop being a business. Okay, thank you.
Open things up to question, and I'm just going to take the host's prerogative and ask you one really brief question. Okay. Is it working? It doesn't like me. We're recording this, so my question for you is, number one, this could be a very populist exercise. That's, this is a great case for populism. Number two, if you just decentralize everything down to the local level, aren't you just reproducing all of the inequities, all of the problems, and how are you going to solve the challenge of development if it's just local data, people making the same bad decisions?
Both great questions, but I have answers. I'm not making a case for populism. I'm not saying get rid of democracy. I'm saying electoral democracy is the foundation of all of this.
Power to the people, that's populism.
No. Power to the people, so is democracy, right? So I'm just saying, let's make democracy better. That's the main argument here. Let's make democracy better. Yeah? There's a reason why autocrats rise. The reason why Perón came up when he did, why Hitler came up when he did. There's a reason for that. Because people are not being listened to. Yeah? Let's change that. So that's my answer. I don't think it's not populist in that sense. Yeah. How do you decentralize? How much do you see decentralized? Can you decentralize everything? Absolutely not. Which is why that wonderful principle of subsidiarity that I think Buchanan wrote most eloquently about. Give power to the level where it is the most appropriate to give, but give all the power to that level. So you cannot. Okay, here. People are not going to like me. I'm not that unhappy that the Department of Education is gone. I think education should be a local issue. I am worried about public health going, because not all of public health can be a local issue. Some of it is, but vaccinations are a federal issue. Should be. So we need to think these things through a little bit better. Where do we decentralize? And then how do we monitor? It requires a different way of monitoring. We cannot do this, business of somebody sending in a report and checking it at the federal level, looking at this, looking at that. No, it's got to be a more people-centered view of monitoring. But absolutely essential. Both those two questions are central to how we should think about how to make this work. Otherwise, it'll be taken over like everything else.
Questions, and if you could just introduce yourself.
Introduce yourself and please disagree with me if you don't.
Yes.
There's no point to deliberation if you don't, there's no disagreement.
Questions.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Omar and I'm associated with the CGM. My question is about the impact of power relationship in a village. I don't know to what extent those villages were religiously, for instance, different, ideationally different. Did you mark them in terms of political orientation and how those differences impact deliberation amongst the people? You mentioned that the median was the one which reflected in the decision making. Now, this point ignores the fact that the power shapes social and power shapes relationships. I don't know to what extent, based on the analysis that you did, you examined those power dynamics within a social context, and how did people mitigate all of those, the least and the marginalized, how they were able to get their points throughout the decision.
Good question. So the magical thing about the Indian 73rd Amendment is that, so I don't know how many of you are familiar with India, but the two big minds of post-independence India, in my view, are a fellow called B.R. Ambedkar and a fellow called Mohandas Gandhi. And these are the two most brilliant people in India at that time. They had very, very different views on this stuff. Yeah, Gandhi, some of you might have seen the movie, strongly believed in the power of village democracy. Ambedkar, who came from the former untouchable caste, from the underprivileged caste, hated the idea precisely for that reason. He thought to be absolutely captured by these elites who oppressed him and his people for so many centuries. And Ambedkar wrote the Indian Constitution. He was the chair of the Constitutional Drafting Committee. Yeah. And Ambedkar hated Gandhi. Later on in life, there's an interview online with the BBC, at 52, I think, where Ambedkar is going on what he really thinks about Gandhi, which is, jars to people. But anyway, that's Ambedkar talking. Ambedkar was a brilliant man. He was a student of Dewey. He got a master's in law from, he got a degree in law from Columbia and a PhD in economics from LSE. Brilliant man, and a lawyer and an economist. So the debate about how much to decentralize in India was a debate between the followers of these two people. The 70th Amendment resolved this by giving power to village democracy, but then doing two important things. One, reserving at least 1/3 of all presidencies of the villages and board memberships to women, and reserving a proportion of seats to underprivileged castes according to the proportion of the population. And that's been going on now since 1993. A lot of my work has been studying those things. And at the end, my belief is those reservations, political reservations, have made a huge difference. They've, over time, brought rise to a political class that is not from the traditional elite groups. Okay? That doesn't mean that all problems have disappeared by any means. There's a lot of elite jockeying that takes place. Yeah? In the Gram Sabhas that I have studied, I find no evidence of elite domination in the deliberative space, partly because elites don't come. They couldn't be bothered. That's one reason. But secondly, even when consequential decisions have to be made, I mean, the evidence is not showing that. Yeah? And my transcripts are not showing that. Okay? Could it happen? Of course. Will it happen in some places that I've not studied? Very much possibly. I'm looking at South India. In those days, South India was and still is way ahead of the North in all of these things. So there could be a difference between North and South, but the North is catching up. Yeah. So religious domination, yes. And there are two reasons for that. In India, basically Hindus and Muslims. Our evidence at that time, I don't know what the case is now, is that Muslims don't participate as much in these meetings. But when they do participate, they're talking about Muslim issues, where the graveyard should be and things of that kind. That's what we find in the transcripts. So they're not talking like public citizens, but taking care of their own communities. Yeah. So there's this polarization that we notice in the data between religious groups. Yeah. Now, having said all of that, is there a better world? Yes, but that better world for me is a world of making this stuff better, not changing the system altogether, because that world is even worse. Yeah. So that's that. So at the end, public policy is about making the best of an imperfect world. My problem with academia, including myself and my colleagues, we all want to live in a perfect, which is madness. We live in a messy, messy world, and we try to do what we can in this messy world so that people don't get screwed. And there are too many people getting screwed because everybody's trying to force a perfect world on an imperfect world. So I'm just saying, stop talking, don't stop this nonsense. Let people directly participate, knowing that some people will dominate others, there'll be this jockeying for power. Let it happen there, not in Congress. There's a mic question.
Here you go, Dan.
So there's an argument.
Introduce yourself.
I'm Dan Berkowitz. I'm in the economics department.
Ah,
Yeah.
so you know what a median is.
It's okay. So there's a concern when there's all this deliberation, it becomes time consuming, and there's selection on the kind of people who deliberate, and other people want to start businesses and do other things besides spending hours a day on deliberation. So also at the World Bank is a controversial study, this doing business survey, and I haven't read the latest thing on it, but I don't know how India does on that. But there's all to get something done, to set up a business. There's all the deliberation, just block entry, businesses, things like that, and also select on people who maybe wouldn't start a business, are concerned about other things.
So the question is, does deliberation focus on certain issues and not on others? Is it?
Yeah, it selects on people.
Yeah.
Who maybe who aren't entrepreneurial, or maybe it does, but it could be associated with lots of barriers to entry and things like that.
Right. So I can tell you the evidence on this. There is selection, but it's selection in favor of the poor in these places because they have the most to gain from coming to these spaces, because it's about allocation of benefits and stuff like that. So that makes sense, right? They're not empowered to do anything on growth and business. So these are not spaces for that at all. The other spaces I look at, the women's self-help groups, they promote entrepreneurial abilities amongst women, among other things. And there you find a real transformation taking place in some places where women haven't even thought about working in the workspace or running businesses. You find that transformation coming through group action and through group support. Yeah. So it becomes support spaces for women who want to start a business, and you get training, you get support. That really makes a difference, right? Now, but that raises an interesting point. Should these spaces be expanded to look at growth opportunities at the local level? And I think absolutely they should be. Yeah, because at the moment they are not. And to me, that's a failing. That's the nature of the Indian state, is that all these powerful decisions are kept in very closed hands. So yeah, but yes, I would agree with that. Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Bruno. I'm an econ grad student as well. I really like what you said about the perverse incentives of academia and the need to democratize data. I think that's laudable and good. But the question that I have is, do you think that you value reflexivism to this extent because you come from a place that has this rich tradition of reflexive policy engagement? Or do you think that's a universal truth that all people all over the world should pursue that and would lead to better outcomes for all of us?
That's a brilliant question. Let me try to answer it in the best way I know how. Context matters. Yeah, it's an obvious point. And have you taken any political science courses?
Not formally.
No, okay. Who has? We're political scientists here, right? Okay, many people. When you study political theory, let me tell you a little bit about American political science. There's something called comparative studies. Who are you comparing against? The United States or Western Europe? Yeah. Because there's a fellow at the bank, I got mad at him, who said, we need democracy because we need to be more like America. He said it 6 months ago, right? Because this is where growth happens. There's a beautiful book by a fellow called Sastavad, I think is an NYU professor. And there's a lot of other work. I've written a paper in India showing you that democracy existed all over the world in some form or the other 3, 4, 5,000 years ago, way before the Greeks. Political theory will not tell you that. It all started with Aristotle and Plato and their contemporaries. And Alexander the Great took it around the world, and it went on from there. Nonsense. Varieties of democracy, particularly deliberative democracy, have always existed amongst all our ancestors. So then to make the case somehow that this idea of what we call democracy, because we've given it a Greek word, demos and kraten, I know all this stuff, by the way, in case you think I don't, is somehow Western and therefore has to be shoved down people's throats like George Bush II tried to do. And that, unfortunately, USAID tried to do. In the version that America developed, in its context, which it borrowed from the French, in their context. Because Rousseau said something at some point and somebody else came along and then, of course, but these are, and the great Mill, but father and son. But what I'm trying to say is there are versions of this in all our histories, whether it's written or not. So to then claim that China is somehow non-democratic, look at Yuan Ang's work. It is a different kind of decision-making that is also deliberative. To claim Vietnam is not democratic. Read Ho Chi Minh's biography, as I'm doing now. The guy came from a democratic tradition, but he wanted a Vietnamese version of that, not the French version. So we have varieties of democracy everywhere. In fact, I'm going to try to write an annual review piece in economics, try to make that case. Yeah, that participation and democracy are all over the world in different forms. The problem happens when we impose one system and put it somewhere else. We have to do it from the bottom up. So thank you for answering that, because I feel very strongly about that.
Yeah, and I just want to maybe just add to that very briefly that the ability of people to participate is universally underestimated. So as a comparativist, universally underestimated. And then you have systems that don't look like our systems. You have egalitarian tribal structures, which have very strong forms of consensus-based decision-making. And those consensus-based decisions, fora, are very participatory, right? And you have to achieve a consensus, so they don't necessarily look like a democracy. They're not first past the post.
And some of the best work on this is done by Native American and First People scholars, talking about their, how their systems of decision-making were undermined by Canada and the United States when it came along. I mean, so there's a lot of this rethinking we have to do in this age. And I think, we can learn from each other. As we have.
I asked because I fundamentally believe it, but I wanted to.
No, I'm glad. No, I'm so glad you asked the question. So it's a question I don't get asked enough. Thank you. Nobody's disagreeing with me.
There's another book, Argumentative India.
Yeah, well, that's another story. Yes, he did. Everything Amartya does is beautifully written. Brilliant writer, brilliant mind. Bad historian. That's all I have to say. Not incorrect. If you want to read about that, read C.A. Bailey. Read his book on liberties. There are many books you can read on Mughal rule. There's a beautiful book, one of the best books on this is by Supriya Gandhi, who's actually Mahatma Gandhi's great-granddaughter, but that's another story. She's a professor at Yale on Dara Shikoh, who was the son of Emperor Shah Jahan, who was then taken over by Aurangzeb and murdered by him. He became the emperor. But Dara Shikoh's ideas of hybridization and ideas, just beautiful ideas he had. Unfortunately, he was murdered. If he had become the next Mughal emperor, the whole subcontinent would have been different. Many of us believe that, but that's a counterfactual that we'll never know the answer to. Yeah.
So just I wanted to continue the previous question. Yes, I'm Dmitry Kafanov. I'm a postdoc here at the Center for Governance and Markets. just want to ask another question. It's more like a political sense. So yes, we have these different forms of democracy historically, but very often, like we have this local democracy of local communities, but an upper level of governance, we have more like authoritarian systems. And I wonder how it makes difference, and can these like local democracies and how develop
Another very, very
different
good,
form of governance.
another very good question that I don't have a good answer to. I worry that authoritarianism, I mean, like all of us, I think in this room, I want elections to happen everywhere. Yeah, but please don't get me wrong. They're terribly important. But I feel, Mary Beard's work on the Roman Empire, she asked the following: why did Caesar cross the Rubicon? Was it Caesar or was it history? So one of the questions she asked. And she says Caesar crossed the Rubicon and that therefore became a dictator. Not because it was Caesar, because the Roman Empire had become so big that it was impossible to manage from Rome. Unless you had a dictatorship. The Republican sort of Senate could manage it. So it was the right historical moment for that to happen. And you see that happening all over the world now with the changes in information systems. I mean, that's why I said democracy as it is today is an 18th century construct. I think that's absolutely right. It's based on an idea of time and travel and communication that's completely out of date, which is why you need to have a representative who had to travel by horse for 2 weeks to go from one end of Pennsylvania to the other. It makes no sense today. How do we reinvent it? There are many, many people think about it. This is my contribution. Whether it'll result in authoritarianism, whether authoritarianism is a natural tendency, I have my fears just like you do. Yeah, I don't have answers to that question. I know that there's a challenge in how we connect the top to the bottom. Whatever the government at the top would be. For instance, in China, this is slowly changing, but for a long time they had local democracy. And going back to I think the Qing dynasty, maybe even further back, there's a wonderful historian called Bin Wong, and I think UCLA who writes about this. They constantly learned from each other. They had systems by which different types of local provincial governments, whatever new methods they developed, they would learn. Going back 2,000 years, they learned from each other. So that's the magic of allowing people to be separate in that sense, developing themselves separately, because new ideas come, and so long as you're able to communicate, right? But China is considered an authoritarian democracy by the powers that be in Washington, which I don't get.
Hello, my name is Reeve and I'm an interested member of the public. Thank you very much for your really interesting talk. I wonder what your thoughts were on this idea that actually often when we decentralise democracies, when we have particularly localised elections, it often ends up having the opposite effect and subverting a lot of that information, because there's just so much going on that the average voter rather rationally doesn't know what's going on, isn't aware of the fact that certain things are the responsibility of other politicians in different layers. So the more layers you have in a government, the more complicated it gets, and actually the opposite effect ends up happening. What do you think about that?
That's why you have ChatGPT. That's not true. I mean, and it was true. I don't think it will be less and less true as we go along. Understanding how something works, getting facts, so long as those facts are not corrupted, so we have to have a credible source, is going to be less and less of a problem, right? So we're developing apps in India. Many people are developing apps in India precisely to answer those kinds of questions. LLM-based apps, by the way. Yeah. So I think those are fixable problems. Yeah. What is not fixable is to have the system itself.
I don't think that those problems have been fixed yet. I mean,
No, they have not been fixed.
Well,
They have not been fixed. No, they have not been fixed. They will be fixed, and they can be fixed. Sorry, they can be fixed, and I hope they will be fixed. Yeah, but I think they can be fixed.
Just to follow up on that, then, as another question, going off of what you presented, are there any parts of the world at the moment, or any regions, whether it's embracing AI to create these changes, or any parts of the world that are using other techniques to create situations which are embracing your worldview a little more?
The honest answer to that question is I don't know yet. I want to write a book on that. Yeah, there is absolutely no part of the world that's perfect, with the possible exception of Estonia. But that's a small country on these issues. Yeah. So Estonia is way ahead of everybody else in digital participation, all kinds of stuff. But I think, for instance, Brazil is superb at some things. India has got this system which even Indians don't like. Indonesians have got something else going on that's amazing. Nepalis, have amazing things going on with all sorts of problems. Yeah, Ran would tell us about Myanmar, which used to be that way. There's all kinds of stuff going on all over the world, all kinds of experiments. What I think I would like to do is to try to see if we can learn from these experiments to see how we can do better. Yeah, but no.
For another 20 minutes, so we're not gonna,
Oh.
keep going.
Okay, did I finish?
Have time, so.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay.
So I'm from social work
Hmm.
and the reflexive approach is not unknown to us.
You could say that.
our Community work. Actually, I had a question for you. I've worked in Assam. I was working with I was working there looking at implementing foster care in the region. And this connecting local, provincial, and federal was a huge challenge. And I don't know if it's the context of Assam.
When was this?
This was the hottest month of my life, August and July and August 22.
Okay.
So we, the biggest problem was the federal laws around child welfare and children and families were clear. The local, and actually it was the most efficient, quick and cheap data collection project I've ever been involved in. And now that I've come back to the US and my doctoral students complain, I tell them to go to Assam and see how to do it. It was amazing to me and just life-changing in many ways. But the problem was, I guess, and I see this here too, how do we make those connections between the local, the provincial, and the federal? The local certainly were very clear about what they wanted for children. The federal government was very clear about what the policy was, but the provincial was kind of stuck.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, India is a constitutional democracy, the division of power across different levels. The local level has the least power in the Indian constitution setup. Most of the power is divided between the states, the provinces, and the central government. On issues like foster care, I think that's the central policy. I think it's based at the federal level. So that depends on what the members of parliament have decided and what the Indian Supreme Court has decided. So I don't know enough about the field, but I would suspect that's where problems come in, is that the provincial and the local authorities had different levels of jurisdiction. So that's the whole subsidiarity thing. How do you decide these things? And that's a question we can debate on that question. I'll tell you a question I don't debate, which is gender. And I'm saying this now, and I'm saying it recorded. Having sat watching gender issues being forced from the West to the South, or the North to the South, really bothers me. The magical thing about women's self-help groups in India is that they've been homegrown for 200 years, and they're based on the Indian feminist movement. We don't have Belinda Gates telling us what to do. Okay, so that to me that's the level of subsidiarity I'm very clear on. Yeah? The World Bank should not be telling you what to do. Now, how we divide up powers within a country is a very complicated subject, and that should be resolved by local politics, I would argue.
Really, we decided the best thing to do is to get out of the way, right? And let locals determine how the policy needs to be implemented.
Yeah.
And support that, but it does take time.
Yeah. I mean, reflexive work is hard. And it's not very rewarding. Yeah. I could have been far more famous if I had written a bunch of academic papers. But I think it's more satisfying. At the end, when I started working, I met a very famous guy called Robert Chambers. Some of you might have heard of him. at IDS Sussex, grand old man of what I'm calling reflexivism, he calls participation. So I met him, I think 20 years ago, and I bought his book to get his signature. And he says, once you read my book, you will be forever changed. If there's something about him, but it's kind of true.
Thank you so much. I'm Kamran. I'm a student at University of Pittsburgh, ISPIA, and also work with CGM. I had a question about this last point you have of get out of the way. And it goes back to I thought the data examples you showed where people could visually, and I guess symbolically see the data rather than, through spreadsheets or regressions or what have you. Well, I guess one question is policy schools, think tanks, etc. Neo-paternalism is very rewarding professionally. It also has a power dynamic of paternalism, I suppose. And so there's a lot of entrenched interest. And so I think moving out of that is itself its own difficult political economy. And then the second thing is when I was looking at the data example, it struck me that it's almost like it requires an engineering mindset of like, what are the things that people need to see in order to make the decisions? And someone has to make that decision beforehand to create, maybe you could say AI could solve that, but even prompting AI and things like that requires some degree of like a theoretical idea of here are the things that might matter that we would want to represent because we care about them, et cetera, et cetera. And so anyway, I guess the broader question is, how do you see either policy schools or the policy development world changing, and how is it different from scholarship, which is like trying to abstract away from decision making to find causal principles, and how do you go back down that ladder of abstraction as a profession?
So let's come straight for the first question first, right? I have no argument with methods. I mean, I'm a trained econometrician. I got my PhD in economics from University of Pennsylvania with Lawrence Klein and all these guys. I know how to do all this stuff. Why do I say that? To be against a regression is stupid. To be against an RCT is stupid. To be against a natural experiment is stupid. You can be against the culture that it generates. You cannot like kind of policies it seems to support. But to be against propensity score matching makes no sense unless you argue that, hey, RCTs do a better job than propensity score matching for such and such reasons. That I'll get. Guido Imbens makes that point very clearly. Now, what I'm trying to say is that these are methods. That's not my problem. My problem is the publication racket. What gets published, like you're saying, the incentives that get people a certain way and how that translates into policy. But I'm also not of the land Pritchett ilk, who argues that all RCTs are bad things. What does he do? Cross-country regressions, right? Which all of us agree are bullshit. His last paper, published 2 years ago, is a one-period cross-country regression, looking at the relationship between growth and development. One country, so one period cross-country regression. Not even panel data. Is that the alternative to RCTs? God forbid. Yeah. So we can use all these methods in support of reflexivism. That's what I try to do. The last one I showed you, that India example, was a national experiment. It's now revised and resubmitted to the AER. The previous one, that was the Journal of Development Economics that I showed you. But they're all published in good journals. Yeah? And they're all using standard techniques. But yeah, I think in the service of reflexivism. Right? So, it's how you see the world. To me, a lot of the RCT types sit in their offices and think that they can make the world a better place. They really want to. That's all credit to them for that, but then they want to force it through a regression. That's the problem I have. Don't think that you can fix the world because you've somehow gone to Harvard. Sorry, I know you have, but still. That's the problem I have. It's not the method. Okay? It's idiotic. In fact, know those methods backwards, please. All right, second question. You see these pictures here? They were co-produced. Cassandra Shia is Chinese American. She grew up in Virginia, but she's parents are Chinese. Brilliant, brilliant woman. She now runs a big climate change thing in the West Coast. So her pictures look like Chinese people. So we took this into the villages. What's this? They don't look like us. Give the man a mustache, man. Give the woman a bindi. It's like, so it was a co-produced visualization. That's why it worked. It was not something done in an office. Yeah, but that's based on Tukian principles. This is all Tukey. I mean, if you read Tukey's visual representation of statistical data, that's anyway, that's tough team who takes it from Tukey. But look at all of this. It's all this is phase forces. This is a phase forces representation mapping. Yeah. This is all very, very good, based on very good statistical techniques. I'm not showing you histograms, right? I'm showing you random samples of the data itself of households. How we visualize and show it to you, but we show you so many that it sort of on average looks good. This is a sample from the census. How are we showing it to you? This is all based on reflexive thinking in data visualization. So everything, it's just a shift. It's how you see the world. Then use all your math skills and statistical skills, data science skills, Python, Python, whatever you have, use it all, right? But in the service of people. That's the only point here.
So I want to
Push a little harder on, so I'm going to give you try to give you a hard time.
Good.
Okay.
I love it.
So is what you're doing just, getting to the implementation issue? And number one, isn't this just sort of Chambers 2.0 dressed up in fancy technology? And the great idea, I mean, I loved a lot of his work and I was deeply inspired by it, but what I saw in practice and my own work practicing it is that it became very cookie cutter. So rather than
I didn't look at that.
Right. I read you, your book inspired me, but it just became very cookie cutter. And you say that, every community has to participate. By the way, you have to sit in a circle and take your shoes off while you do it and draw a map and do this community mapping exercise. Okay. And then second, when it comes to, there's a missing piece, I'm wondering, in your argument here, and that has to do with the bureaucracy. So it's wonderful if we all sit around and make a nice decision and map what our problems are, but then actually fixing that problem or addressing that problem takes something, someone, whether it's a public service, private service, and the motivation for much of your talk today is related to democratic backsliding, concerns about this, right? So can't we argue that it's very easy to transition to a democracy? Elections are not administratively fairly easy, right? So you can be in Eastern Europe one day and have preference falsification, and the next day you're Estonia, right? So that transition can happen very quickly, but the operating system of a government changes very, very slowly. And we know this from all of the work that you cited, right? All of the work on the bureaucracy. And so, but that's not a sexy topic. Nobody wants to talk about bureaucracy, and it's really hard to do some RCTs, so then you get a mismatch between the operating system of a highly participatory system where everybody believes their voice matters, and then you get a public bureaucracy that is, I mean, I think this is maybe what we're seeing here in the United States, that is not responsive, is slow, riddled with regulation, hard to change. And then imagine the challenges you see in other parts of the world that have far lower levels of state capacity. And of course, people are frustrated with this. And so they said, I voted, I participated. It's not just clientelism or corruption. It's actually that the bureaucracies themselves don't get enough attention. Reforming them is hard. Of course, there's vested interests, but that's a much slower change. And why don't we ratchet our expectations differently?
Very good, Jen. Thank you. It is Chambers 2.0, yes. But Chambers 1.0, which is what localizing development is about, was essentially taking Chambers' techniques, not his vision, but his techniques, and Chambers leading the charge, forcing it via the World Bank to the rest of the world. Mad! For God's sakes, that's what I'm arguing here. I'm talking context. I'm saying, I'm just showing what I did in India. One person in 4 states in one part of the world. What you might do in Afghanistan or wherever else might be completely different. How do we involve people depends on those people. Depends on what works there. Estonia, I won't import Estonia and take it to India yet. Not yet, maybe later. Yeah. So no, please. I mean, it would be horrifying if this became something that you just bang down people's throats. No. However, if we want to democratize data, in the United States, it might look very different from this. By the way, the kind of stuff I'm doing here is what they're doing in First Nations, with some First Nations folks in Alberta and Canada. It's very similar. So there may be context, but there's a good match. In other places, it make no sense at all. But democratizing data as a principle can be done. So yes, I 100% agree with you. But yes, I mean, Robert was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, so am I. To that extent, we're coming from very much the same tradition. I've been inspired by Robert as well. Yeah. When Robert first did his work in India, just a bit of personal history, my dad was running the outfit which did the participatory exercise all over the country. So I saw that at a young age, very early on. So that's one way I learned about all of this stuff. No question. Yeah. But I would not do what those guys did, where it went. That in fact defeats the whole purpose. Okay. Sorry, second question. Bureaucracies. Same point. To me, I mean, Dan Honig has some work on this, reflexive bureaucracies. How do we make bureaucracies more reflexive? I mean, that's part of what we're doing here. And it's not just adaptation and all of this stuff, it's actually reflexive. Adaptation is about bureaucrats who kind of know what they want in the world, doing better by learning by doing. But no, how do we bring people into the process? That to me is the trick. How do we make that happen? I think there's a lot of good thinking we have to do on this. I'm working in India with Arvind Chaudhary, with Umam Hadev, and some wonderfully very senior reflexive bureaucrats. So they exist. How do we make them do better work? That's what I would say. Yeah.
We haven't exhausted you.
No.
Okay, so
It's
I
just-
think we've exhausted our questions. Oh, we have one more. Oh,
two more.
yes,
Okay.
two more. Okay.
So my name's Priyoma. I'm in the economics department as well. So my question is sort of following up on that. Where,
Yes.
yes.
Okay.
So with in relation to bureaucracy. So in my opinion, I mean, I could be totally wrong, but this is also bringing a lot of savings. You're telling people where they stand and where they don't. So you're making them aware of their problems, right? You're making the public aware. And where do you think that they feel about them being heard? Even if they're aware of their problems, that doesn't mean that I believe I'm going to be heard. And if I do better because elected, so I know the second one that you showed where, the elected party officials were better than the ones where Karnataka, where the bureaucracy was happening due to the COVID. But that still doesn't get into the fact that I might believe that I'm not going to be heard, which brings back to the same problem that how do you get the bureaucrats to not only get to see this data that you have collected in a very innovative manner involving people, but you need to get the participants and the public to feel like they're going to be heard.
No, very good point, which is why I'm showing you this slide, that the whole point was data feedback. So it was not just visualizations. In Gram Sabhas in Tamil Nadu, there were two things going on. There was a World Bank project that gave a lot of money to women's organizations in the village, and there was the Gram Panchayat budget as well. The visualizations were shown in those communities. And then collectively, decisions were made about how to spend that money. So in fact, they were heard. And so without the Gram Sabha or institutions like that, the data collection becomes a data collection exercise. Absolutely. Yeah. So that feedback is terribly important. Yeah. So whatever we know doesn't go away. That's even democracy. Electoral democracy doesn't go away. I'm just asking, how do we make these things better, more people-centered? That's all. Yeah.
And the second question is, so you did this where, you went back and you did, it's essentially a sort of census in another round, right? What is your take on us not having a census in so many years?
I'm being recorded. I think there's a I don't know why they're not having a census. I have my speculations. I'm sure you're an Indian citizen, I suppose. As I'm sure you do, you have your ideas about why the census is not being held. I have my views. Maybe our views are different. Maybe they're different. Maybe they're not. But there must be very, very reasons. There's no technological reason why a census can't happen. But the idea of a census what is the earliest census we know of? I think it is the Roman census. I mean, somebody knows better. Were there censuses before the Roman Empire that we know of? So with an old technology, very old technology, of going house to house, filling up questionnaires, old technology. I feel we can improve that technology. And I'm not saying that this would substitute for the census, but citizen-led data can be done more frequently, much more quickly, and with, let's say, just as much accuracy. I'm not saying it's going to be perfectly accurate, neither is the census. Yeah.
Better framed questions.
And better framed questions. I mean, better framed questions, then you have to trade off between certain questions that are universal because you want those broad patterns to be comparable plus local. So you need to have that trade-off. And we had that here. So that those again subsidiarity decisions that can be made. Yeah. But at the end, that's where I feel we can go with all of this stuff. And we don't even, satellite data, once it gets better and better, there's all kinds of cloud cover issues and so on, we know now. But satellite data will at the end tell us a lot. I mean, by the way, Shamika Ravi, others are doing a lot of good work on this in India itself. Yeah, so moving in that direction. So there's already a movement in that direction. Do we have to keep doing very, very costly, inaccurate surveys? Is that the only way to collect data? The whole data group of the World Bank who does this all the time. And I wonder why. Now, we should be thinking about different ways of collecting data. As imperfect as they may be, they're just as imperfect as survey systems. Okay, so I hope that answers the question. Thank you. You're trying to get me there, but